Great, thanks for having me in this jolly time, Christmas, right? Christmas all around. There's going to be a student party, possibly that's where most of people are. I would be there too, and we will be there. So, this is a bit of a delayed gratification that is pretty specific for arts, right? In which you toll now under the premise that you will drink champagne later. This premise not necessarily materializes as often as people would wish. It's a winner's takes it all economy in which few people benefit and most of them toil as part of what Gregory Cholet terms as artistic dark matter. But this is something for later, or maybe not at all. We can talk about it. We do not have to. The book is structured as a kind of lexicon, but in fact it is a hypertext. So it is discussion about living and working in a precarious art world is distributed amongst, let's say, I think it's 66, 67. I always miss calculation. It's actually not so easy to count all these entries. Like I count and count and count, and then at the end I always think it's 66 or 67, whatever. But it's around this number of entries in which this type of condition, which on the one hand seems to be very distributed and chaotic, on the other hand it's systematically interlinked, is being mapped. So you have entries, and you have like these entries being, this list of contents is being also printed, so we can take a look, right? There are entries for A is for application, D is for deadline, E is for enthusiasm, I is for independence, N is for networking, then there is N for neoliberalism, and W for winner takes it all. You may not think that enthusiasm is related to a cruel economy of art, but somehow it is, or not even somehow, it is actually at the core of the project. Because even though people who freelance, every project that they do is a marvel of social collaboration, they move between projects as individuals who are solely responsible for their own success. Or at least that's what is a kind of like systemic ideology that propels this mobility, tells them. You are the sole maker of your own success. While in fact we know from from the kind of observation, sort of like systemic analysis, that this success is dependent on many factors. For example, like in this seemingly horizontal network, in order to move, you need to have a good passport, right? If you don't have a good passport, in a sense, the access is bad. Something that for us, it's like for us, I'm just assuming, like for me, at least. It's an easy thing. I just simply take a flight, and come here. For somebody who comes from outside of the fortress Europe, this requires a huge effort in order just to get a visa, come over, make it tick. Easy, hard, right? This is a very preliminary, very fundamental difference, right? Precarious, like freedom of freelancing, freedom of making projects. For some people, or like making projects, like flexibility that comes with this. If you compare it, we are here in a kind of formal industry, right? If you compare this mode of working, it may be liberating, it may be exhilarating, it may be enthusiastic, right? For people who can afford it, right? If you do not have to work on an assembly line, if you work, in your home office, you have the freedom to move. That's a condition to be enjoyed by people who do not have to make one project after another and many in the same time, always anxious whether they will or will not secure the next opportunity to make their living, right? So here comes a different form of privilege, which is related, let's say, to class that comes with a kind of mostly inherited wealth. And wealth not only in an economic sense, but also in social or cultural sense, right? If you're well-heeled, if you can rely on silver lining, then much easier for you to change this flexibility into freedom. If you don't, this becomes precarity, this becomes dependence on the will and whims of another. on the kind of, sometimes personalized, sometimes very distributed systems of distributing visibility, distributing money, distributing opportunities, on which you are reliant when you want to create this kind of, if you want to patch together this type of trajectory. But still, I'm starting to talk about the book, but I'm starting to give you an entire narrative, just as a prompter for what's going to happen next. I typically start with basically origins of this research and so on and so forth. I'm not sure whether, like thinking about all this glue wine that is waiting somewhere out there, whether this is something that I need to expand upon in detail. As Max knows, who was filming me today in the morning, and the guys here, that I can really, when switch the button, I can just start talking, and 2 hours later, you are all left, and I'm still here talking. But maybe just a couple of words about this origins of research, how the book is structured. Then this kind of performance, which gives actually reins me in a sense that it gives a very timed structure to discuss a couple of entries, but that are part of this book project, or like that constituted, and then we can go into discussion. We can talk about entries, we can talk about aspects, we can talk about whatever you think. We can talk about when this originated, like some of these things were being discussed in the air, or like they were basically out there already for more than 2 decades, right? Here in Germany, this discussion was pretty vivid in early 2000s. But still, first, like about origins of this research. So this originated basically as a kind of logbook into my own practice, or like some sort of like thinking about what do we do when we do projects. I'm still kind of like freelancing from time to time. So like like matters of evidence, for example, is something that I do after hours, right? But now I have a stable academic position, which definitely helps you to turn flexibility into freedom rather than into precarity, right? If you have academic position, it's much better, much easier. But when I started to think about this book, which was in 2000s, I was just doing like one project after another, many in the same time, like basically shoestring curating type of thing, and hundreds of applications, blah 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 blah. We know the drill in a sense. This drill in my case was conducted in Warsaw, which is a semi-peripheral country, and this type of condition of being kind of, let's say, end of the EU accession, right? I still remember when we didn't have right to work in EU. It changed 2004, and it was a huge transition for the generation of people to come. I witnessed how it transformed for my students currently. The only world they know is a world in which they are free to travel and to work in the West. But we could cherish this mobility, this kind of access. On the other hand, typically being more like poor cousins in rich man's club, right? You have access, however, you can't really afford the drink. Funny, not funny, like doable and good, like expanding world, like kind of peak globalization. Now we live in a different world. I think like lots of these things that this kind of like mythologies that emerged as part of this peak globalization of the horizontal networks, of the free world, of the kind of borderless world. We see that this is a kind of that this was illusionary ideological construct. And even when it was, even at the peak, it was not necessarily as free and as borderless as people would wish it to be. But anyway, this kind of experience, right, of making projects in a semi-peripheral condition shaped this book tremendously. Then, another thing that contributed to this reflection was all the kind of research centers, self-organized research collectives like Frieslau University of Warsaw, Center for Plausible Economies, Critical Practice, and many others with whom I cooperated, and kind of artistic trade unions with whom I collaborated and worked and reflected upon the very conditions of our own existence. or like living and working in a precarious art world, right? So there is this collective research, but definitely this book is rooted in. Then there came a moment in which I was able to make a PhD, and then I had an opportunity to transform, let's say, this more fuzzy, kind of more para-institutional, more self-organized reflection into a structured narrative, an argument. And this couple of years when you are paid to think and paid to write definitely helped to make it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to actually really conduct this in this type of systemic manner. But then, after the PhD was done, which is like 2010, 2015, let's say 2009 to 2014, when it was in the making, I was invited to publish a book in Polish. And this book actually, in fact, was first published as a Polish book, ABC Projektariatu. And this process of translating the narrative of that is very dull. You know, when you write PhD, it's basically, you can be pretty certain that there are 4 people in the world who hate you for writing it. There are like 2 supervisors and 2 examiners, right? And they really don't like you. I mean, they don't like the situation, but they have to read it, you know. Maybe your colleagues and mom, but, you know, like I wouldn't expect it from my mom to read a, you know, PhD, especially in English. But anyway, this is something that, you know, but then you have to reforge it, reformulate it, remold it into something that is more or less accessible and interesting to be read. You have to turn it into some kind of compelling narrative. And the way how to do it in my case was to write a lexicon. Maybe I talk about it because you see, like, there are like a lot of this transitioning also in terms of language. So this originated as a sort of like as a research that was conducted by a group of people in Warsaw, but then we were inspired by Italian texts translated to English, Negri, Lazzarato, others, right? So this was a kind of like post-Marxist thinking that contributed to it. So this kind of like, let's say, English to like Italian theories translated into English, but then applied in a different, in the different circumstances by us to think about what's happening around. Then it was written as basically English PhD, and then it was retranslated back to Polish, and some terms emerged in the process. So sometimes that this book is kind of sprinkled with, like the very Projektariat itself emerged in the process of this translation. So when I was doing the English book, I used some kind of like really silly terms, like completely, you know, I'm not very proud of myself. Like, I don't know, what was it, cynical opportunists or something like, or progressive opportunists, what the heck is that, right? Or like project makers. Nobody wants to hear about a project maker. Who is this person, right? And then, like, when I was translating this book into Polish, a friend told me, "Oh, Kuba, why don't you talk about Projektarians?" You know, because back then we were a lot of talking about art workers, robotnicy sztuki in Polish. So he said, "Oh, maybe Projektarian. This is the term you look for." And once you find this kind of term, this is like a, you know, gift that keeps giving. It's like a blessing, you know, like you basically have a term, and then you can turn the term into, it propels your thinking, drives your narration, helps you going, and helps you to shape what you are about to say. And that's what happened with Projektariat. So then, in the English book, this kind of like a weird tongue twister, you know, became something that drives a narrative. And there are a couple of other things like that, like, for example, Pata-institutions. Pata-institutions is inspired by pataphysics. Pataphysics is a romantic concept coming from late 19th century. Dr. Faustus Pataphysician, Alfred Jarry. And this emerged when we were about to translate an English term, mock institution, and nomadic institutions or monster institutions. There was a lot of talk in the 2000s about artistic self-organization. People used a lot of different terms. Most of them translated very, very poorly into Polish. They just didn't make any sense. So like mock institution, which is a term by Greg Cholet, it's more of a concept that covers institutions that are called universities, though they are not. Right, so like, for example, you have a Free-Slow University of Warsaw. It definitely wasn't a university. It was some sort of, but yet it served an important social function. So, for example, the discussion we prompted, or like we contributed to, about art workers, about all this discussion about artwork is work and so on and so forth. It was very obscure when we started. Now it is a common knowledge in Poland. Like everybody talks about Dark Matter by Cholet, you know, like possibly more in Poland than in UK or here, which is a funny fact. But anyway, this is so then, you know, like they serve important social function. But if you call it niby instytucja in Polish, they do not really. It doesn't really translate. It doesn't really tell you the importance of this kind of self-organized collectives. So then we came with this pata-institutionalism, just as a way of covering a kind of topic, finding a kind of right word to cover something that is otherwise wouldn't be very well understood. And it's still not, because pata-institution is, you know, it's a term that it needs to be explained. And yet, this covers something, I think, that it helps you to organize a discussion, or to start a discussion, or to do something with terminology that is a bit, maybe, I mean, theories are not very jolly, you know, but still, you know, but maybe a bit kind of, there is a bit of an irony, there is a bit of a pun and twist and linguistic fun that you can have with this kind of terms and entries. So the book, instead of being purged from this kind of linguistic residue, it's a bit dirty. It is a bit. I don't know how, you know. For English people, it sounds that some people find it quite funny or quirky in a sense of how this is narrated. But it was for me important to keep this kind of process of translation as something that is part of the narrative, and not something that is cleaned, that this is you know, erased, or that it pretends to be just high academic English. I don't think that it is. It's something else, and I think that this actually contributes to why this book may be an interesting read, especially that we all are part of this kind of international English sort of milieu, that we all are, most of us are forced to use a language which is not our mother tongue, and it's not Esperanto, it is English, right? So at least, you know, we can have a bit of a revenge on this linguistic domination and write a bit of bollocks, you know. But I think this is enough as an introduction. I hope it gives you a bit of a understanding from where this book originates. And maybe I will now start with this teletombola, as some people call it. And I would propose, but we can think about it, between 120 and 150 seconds, or between 100 and 150, or 100 and 150. What shall we go for? Shorter, longer? Longer. 142. 147. 147? Okay. It can be 147. Right. And now I typically do not. It's not so easy for me to seat. Done. 1, 2, 3. Go, network. Right. So if we think about contemporary art networks, they are full of networkers. And networkers are people who basically traverse contemporary art circulation in search of the new projects. And interestingly, in the book that very much inspired this research, which is New Spirit of Capitalism by Luc Boltanski and Yves Ciapello, they talk about networkers in very negative terms. So for them, networkers are people who basically move around networks in order to not even glean, but rather to find new trends, to find new idioms, to look for them and then to present them as their own. So there are people who are using connections but not necessarily expand them. And for Boltanski and for Ciapello, they think about this kind of like project-based world, or like this fluid world as also as a certain type of ethical order. So it's not only this new spirit of capitalism about which they discuss. is basically shaped after Weberian concept of a spirit of capitalism, right? Max Weber, you think about origins of capitalism as in this, based on this Protestant ethics, right? Of tribe, of hard work, of becoming, let's say, very entrepreneurial, but also very disciplined in your own economic pursuits. That's what Weber explained. And about origins of capitalism in, like, let's say, 15th, 16th century. And when Boltanski and Ciapello talk about new spirit of capitalism, they think more about people who are part and parcel of this kind of networks, but they not only take, but also give back. So they embody a logic of network in this sense that they help to expand connections. Because this is a kind of like, that's what propels it, right? Like expansion, and then like making new connections and making new links. And networkers, in their understanding of the world, are people who do not do it. They kind of like, they soak in, they traverse, but they keep it all for themselves. And that's how the hierarchies are being created. And one of the important aspects of the contemporary art networks is what Louis Boutin calls pollination. So basically, this is how contemporary forms of commons are being made. He asks a question, but you may know the answer for. So what is the economic role of bees? Anybody knows economic role of bees? Sorry? Hive? It's an organization. What is an economic role of bees? What do the bees do, like economically? What do you think? What they produce? Sorry? They basically, what they do not necessarily, because people think that bees produce honey, but in fact the main economic function is that they pollinate, right? So this is, bees basically fly, they are like, hives are being hired. I mean, you have like these gigantic tracks that are moving from orchard to orchard or from plantation to plantation, so that like bees pollinate the crops. Without bees, the crops would not be there. And Boutin uses this to explain how the contemporary economies operate, how these fluid networks function. That you need people who basically pollinate others. So they spread ideas and they maintain the vivid exchange which is necessary for any singular proposition to emerge, right? So you are thinking about all this, like all these topics that are on fellow travelers, right? Or like in matters of evidence. You think about the areas of study, you think about migration, you think about climate catastrophe, you think about whatever, right? And then you need people who are basically part of the entire community of this network as a kind of very distributed system who spread these ideas, who maintain the circulation of them. And that's what I call in this book labor of pollination. So basically it's a very important function of the meetings such as ours, but or any kind of, it can be a small chit chat, it can be formalized exchange, it can be informal exchange, is basically to maintain the flow of ideas. And then when you make projects, which are temporary pockets of accumulation, you basically use this as a kind of like, let's say, commons. You use it as a sort of resource in order to come up with an interesting idea that you can pursue and make a project about. And every project is an opportunity to be seized. If we think about networks as very fluid and flexible systems of social organization, right? And the flow that networks are composed of is constituted by fleeting opportunities. You can think about it as basically a flow of interchangeable opportunities that people need to grab in order to make their living. And this is not only part and parcel and bread and butter of contemporary art, but you have this kind of like relationship, let's say, between an individual producer or a team of producers, an opportunity to be seized. It is a fundamental aspect of contemporary, flexible, neoliberal labor markets. So think about workers who do not have, and this is such a typical situation. You started with ZKM, right? We have like a couple of it's a very tired system. So you have people who are having a very stable work positions, who may work here for life. And then you have all the younger people who will not be given a kind of stable contract, because then they would be employed for life, right? So then, if you get a contract for a year, for 2, for 3, for 4, right? There is always a moment. This job is almost like a project, right? There is always a moment in which it's finished, and then you need to look for the new opportunity. And that's what Paul Virno identified as one of the post-Marxists that I talked about at the beginning, as a fundamental tenet of being kind of like a free subject on neoliberal labor market. But you always need to look for opportunities. And opportunities are always given only for a moment. So he talks about opportunism not as a moral flow, but rather as a relation of production. And he uses a kind of like a ancient Greek reference to explain it. He says that opportunism comes from opportunus, I think, or like it's Latin, I think. It's which meant favorable wind that brings you to a safe harbor. So this is, like all these kind of networkers, let's say, and all these flexible producers are looking for these opportunities that would bring them to the next project and would provide them with a kind of like, let's say, temporary shelter. But it's important to think about it not as one system, as one system that is being experienced by everybody in the same way. So there is a huge difference between people who are moving between these opportunities if they are not forced to look for them. What does it mean? If you have a stable, if you, for example, own a flat in one of the primary metropolitan locations, you are well sorted. You are not forced to look for yet another freelancing job or opportunity just to pay your bills, right? You have it secured. If you have a good passport, it's much easier for you to chase these opportunities because you can simply be where others are, and you can be seen on the scene. Right? If you have an income coming from rent, then it's much easier for you to go for all these unstable jobs or underpaid or unpaid jobs. And you may even enjoy it because they are all fun. Right? It's fun to make these projects. It's fun to use these opportunities. But it makes huge difference whether you come from 1% or you don't. Whether you can rely upon these sources of wealth that is mostly inherited, or whether you are exposed to all these forces at play and you consider them as a storm that you just need to somehow weather, finding this new safe, like a kind of like new safe haven, right? So it's something that, like for some, these waters are much more calmer than for others. So for some networks are in fact a zone of self-actualization and of freedom to pursue their creative interests, while for some others they are exposed to all the risks and dangers, and instead of freedom they end up with precarity. What is also interesting in this kind of networks is a very specific kind of time. They do something very specific with how we think about time. Think about application, right? In every application, what you do, you basically use the fragments of your own past, of your own trajectory, of the projects done in the past, in order to secure something for the future, right? You reassemble what you did in order to secure something that you will do when you grab an opportunity. You need to also hedge your risks, right? You behave as if you were an investment banker. You need to think, okay, do I pursue only one application or shall I write 17? Right? There is always a risk calculated in it. And once if it is a kind of like formalized application, once you secure it, you end up being kind of bound to what you did write as part of the application process, right? So you have this kind of like, it's a time machine in this sense that it sets time in stone, right? It sets something, you say in, let's say, 2024, what you will do in 2027. And then think about stuff like COVID, or like think about stuff like, it's on the one hand, it forces you to hedge your risks, but on the other hand, it prevents you to take any risks when you get it. Right? Because it's about time, but it's very structured, and time that has to be predictable. It's a smooth time and straighted time, but you need to think about as something that can be predicted, as something that can be controlled, and something that needs to be invested in. And this is also a part of what Suhail Malik calls a kind of neoliberal time complex, in which you have, he thinks about more like financial markets, in which also reassembles the future, like in terms of hedging, but this kind of like hedged future influences your current activities and may create different kind of speculative bubbles. But the point with these neoliberal time machines, and maybe I will finish here and then we can go to the discussion, is that they, in fact, on the one hand, they are based on the idea that time is very fluid and that you need to hedge your risks. But on the other hand, they are all based on the concept that everything will be in the future like it is now. And they are not able to, so, if you hedge your risks, it definitely does not account for the major upheavals or for the major shifts in how things are going to be, right? You think about the future as a future that is continuation of the present. In fact, this kind of neoliberal time machines just eradicate agency in a sense of thinking what can be done with our timelines and how can we reshape our present so that the futures will be different. And one of these kind of unpredictable things, but these unpredictabilities are, I think, piling up one upon another. Unpredictabilities such as Brexit, Trump election, like authoritarian wave, right? Like all this kind of disruptive moments that in early 2000s or, were completely being eradicated from our imagination. In a sense that we all thought that that's the end of history, that this is going to be, interesting, like basically the liberal globalization is therefore granted and that this will continue. And anti-fascist, and one of the actions that one of the kind of, let's say, disruptions that we did face, at least in Poland, was basically authoritarian government. And then you have, as with our colleagues, other Projektarians, we organized several activities and we partook in anti-fascist coalitions to stem or to somehow work against this kind of shift to the right. I will maybe, and this is, I think, like I use it as an example, this anti-fascist year, I use it as an example how you can, instead of making one project after another, you can rather think about organizing projects that would align themselves with social movements or like with the grander social causes or movements or struggles in order to shift the debate or to steer the future and reclaim and repurpose these time machines that are projects for the wider social let's say that the project, instead of being just an art project, artists, curators, and others become partake in this much grander projects. Like Boris Groys was talking about project as the origin of the world is basically thinking about the future, that you can project something in the future and work for this together with others. There is a kind of avant-gardist element in it. And in order to go into this mode, you do not, you need also to operate outside of the main kind of modus of operation that is very specific to contemporary art networks, which is co-opetition, which is a kind of like, this is actually a managerial term for a type of behavior in which you cooperate with your competitors in order to, for example, grow a piece of software or like develop a piece of software, and then you still maybe competing with others with whom you co-developed it. You have like enterprises that may be competitive, and yet you work on something together. And I think this is a typical mode of operation for quite a lot of people in contemporary art, in which they, even if they collaborate with each other, it's always under the premise that still there are individuals who need to secure individual access for themselves. They are opportunists who need to struggle against others in order to secure these opportunities, because they always traverse between projects and in the networks as individuals. So even if there is a cooperative element in this mode of production, and I think that there is a very strong cooperative element in that. Still, there is a even as present, or even more striking, or even more important, is this competitive element in the network. And maybe I can finish here. You see, I just need like I need to. Sorry, sorry. One more. Okay. And one of the let's say very fundamental and important elements of these time machines that are constitutive for contemporary art networks is eradication of the reality of the climate catastrophe, I think. It's it's poverty jet set all over, right? I came here by plane. I will go by plane. This is how we do stuff, right? This is and if you are not mobile, you are basically excluded. And yet, in this book, I try to avoid like kind of cheap moralizing or some sort of middle class blame game, in which we think about ourselves as individual consumers. I think much more important in terms of footprint or carbon miles. Is rather the relation, and I use their examples from Art Basel, is a relation between high-end blue-chip art market and the plutocratic class, this 1% that I talked about before. That is, I think, fundamental for how the world is being organized. So art is a luxury good that is being consumed by the ultra-rich, as part of the super polluting, the super polluters, basically. Whereas you have reports being published, I don't remember whether it was Greenpeace or other kind of organization, such like, that 50% of emissions are created by 10% of the richest population on Earth. And the kind of like global 1% has like a tremendous impact on our future. Even just moratorium on super yachts or moratorium on private jets would really would change the would help us to reach kind of climate goals. And yet contemporary art prefers to kind of like to indulge in, or like contemporary art, like contemporary people who operate in contemporary art, there is a tendency to indulge in a mockery of this, no. In the mockery of this type of consumption, following it, like this kind of nomadic producers follow the flow of international capital, follow the money, let's say, while maybe taking, like economy class, and yet they still flock to Venice, to Basel, to other destinations like that, or to Greece, etc., right? This is a kind of like important point of reference. Kind of fueling this type of time machines that basically eradicate social agency in preventing the reality of climate catastrophe, right? So you can think about rather like, that's what I argue in this book for, is that you can change this flow of projects and think rather about how to embed it, this kind of like individual projects in the kind of like more grander, let's say, project of more egalitarian social order that would be able to stem or to prevent or at least to somehow design our responses to the grim reality of climate catastrophe. Yeah, thank you. Now we talk?
Sit down now, okay?
Oh, yeah.
Rest.
Yeah. I mean, if you want me to talk about any of his entries, we can do it, or we can maybe have like just a conversation. That would be just as nice. Or maybe you have
or both.
Or both. Yeah.
But it made me also realize I didn't go to Venice this year.
Well, I did.
Yeah, but nonetheless, you still, even when you're not in a precarious position, you have incredible fear of missing out and of not being. It totally highlights that memory. Oh my God, I'm going to miss those meetings, those networks, those moments, those opportunities. And it really is this kind of state that it totally infiltrates the whole psyche of the art world. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, like being part of being seen on the scene, right? Being part of the crowd. That's something very, very important. There is one entry here dedicated to Venice. It's about artisan. Like
you have to explain artisan. Here's a good one.
Well, artisan, it's not necessarily based on Aperol, though.
Kind of.
I mean, Aperol is too sweet anyway. Like who can drink Aperol? Not too much. But then too much. But well, whatever. It is one of these terms that came from this sort of like linguistic messing around. So it is a term that we came up with Bristol University of Warsaw when we were conducting research about people who are circulating in contemporary art field in Poland. And then we thought, okay, so like you have this typical kind of situation in which people are underpaid, insecure, and yet everybody wants to do art. Or like people who are artists, at least, because that's usually, not so many people wants to do art. Thanks God. But still, the ones who want to do it, they are very dedicated to this pursuit. And then we came up with this funny concept of artisan, which is a mix between artist, like the same in Polish, art, artysta, and then muchozol, which was a bug spray in Poland. So, a kind of artisan as a sort of substance that makes people forget about the economic interests and pursue these artistic careers as if they were up for grabs. Yeah. And Venice is full of it. Yeah.
Which also then touches on enthusiasm as a term as well, because the whole system is fueled by people being over-enthusiastic about what they do.
Yeah. Without very kind of enthused and infused and
But also what is different about the art situation than anywhere else in your eyes? Because you could say this is the same in the design world or architecture world or maybe even teaching, these days. Trades that were once jobs for life are now being compartmentalized and projectized and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I think it very much depends, right? It depends on the sector. But a lot of middle-class jobs or positions are structured in this way. And they take from art this concept of delayed gratification. So you basically think, okay, so it's something that you invest yourself into. You're kind of both not necessarily entrepreneurially, but also enthusiastically, right? It's something that you need to commit to very long periods of low pay, underpay, insecure jobs in order to make it in the future, right? And this is, I think, Boltanski and Esquire talks about economies of enrichment, which is like fashion-related, heritage-related, tourism, cultural, creative industries. And this type of situation is very, I think it's very common in this kind of sectors. But I think that like, if you think, for example, about consultancy jobs, usually, and like, I'm talking about, I don't know, consultancy, like economic consultancy, right? Typically, these jobs are paid. You may have like a period of interning, but when you're a very young one. But once you enter into industry, you simply earn money for your commitment, right? You just, you get paid. And in contemporary art, this is not the case. Just think about, this is a shifting landscape. Think about, for example, curatorial positions. Once they became prestigious, once they became from being just custodians employed or conservators or art historians employed by big museums, right? I mean, that's what curator used to be in 50s, 60s, right? They became kind of freelancers, and they became prestigious positions. In a sense, you named them on the posters and so on and so forth. Curators stopped to be paid. They stopped to be hired. You just become also one of the cultural operators in which you need to commit yourself to underpaid or unpaid jobs in order to secure a better position in the future. The problem with this delayed gratification is that it is a kind of as-if economy. Everybody behaves as if somebody else in the future would pay you. But this is not necessarily a case, because everybody behaves like this, right? So, even if you are like 40, 50, 60, people still tell you as if you were like, in your 20s, and they still treat you as if somebody else in the future would pay you. And this is a pretty funny thing if you are not unpaid. I mean, if you're unpaid, that stops to be funny, right? Because you are simply not paid. And but saying all this, people are not helpless victims, right? So is this as-if economy may actually materialize, but not necessarily in a way that you would think about it. So it's not necessarily that you become a famous curator, but you may be employed as an academic, as I did, right? Or not necessarily you would. One of the fundamental things about this kind of as-if economies in contemporary art is that it's based on a art market premise. It's very convenient for a lot of institutions, right? I mean, you know how it is. You basically organize an exhibition. You do not pay like big honoraries to people if you pay anything. Lots of people do not pay anything. And then, it's as if this exhibition helped an artist to establish themselves as commercially viable, as commercially viable. So that they would basically, so it's based on the kind of concept that you are maybe not paid by an institution, but you have a gallery representation. This gallery is skilled enough to secure your foothold on the market, and then that this exhibition will become a part of the trajectory or of the chain of events that will help you to commercialize your art. Commercialize in the sense of sell it. I'm not saying in a kind of. I'm not saying it in a judgmental or negative sense, right?
No, I mean it's just the reality, and it goes the other way as well. You have commercial. Most museums now, certainly in Europe, I would say, can't afford to buy the artworks that they show.
Yeah.
On the whole.
Yeah.
So they rely on, but they're showing them because they get visibility from for the galleries and the artists who rely on the museums to sanction and value, create value. Yeah. So everybody's even the 1% and so on are locked into this system.
Yeah, I mean, like there is still, there is this kind of public art museums are still part of like public, even if they are privately owned, they still operate as if they were public entities. They are definitely part of the system of kind of creating artistic value and let's say the decisions about collections and so on and so forth. It's still, I think, considered to be important, even by private agents, right?
Yeah. To the point where now that you often have this new thing where if you have a waiting list from collectors to buy a work, they will make you buy two, one for yourself and one for the museum. Yeah. So that then increases the value. But then the demand on to do that is then again affects the artist, because the artist, has to produce to this order. Yeah.
I mean, here I did not really talk about the market arrangement. Possibly in ABD of Dark Rabbits, like in the next book project.
Yeah, but maybe I just explain the ABD of Dark Rabbits.
Yeah. No, it's like I'm thinking about a new book project that would maybe discuss more, because this book is focused on the social mechanisms of making projects, which does not cover the entirety of artistic economies even. And it's also because they are still driven by this kind of, let's say, hyper-accelerated gallery system, or like art market system. It's like what Boltanski would call a capitalist mode of circulation. It's not a critic gallery system. It's much more than that, in a sense that galleries are part of this hyper circulation, in which they actually can be minor players unless they are blue chip galleries. But anyway, in this book I do not really discuss art market at all. It's more about projects, and I also do not discuss what people do when they do these artistic projects. So what kind of art they do, right? And it's also important to underline that projects in art is actually a very ambivalent mode of organization, because they help to organize stuff outside of artistic studio, right? I mean, like this basically, when I talk with Marta Rosler, and I ask, okay, so when was the project? When you started to do projects? She said, oh, possibly in early 80s, nobody knew what it was, but when I did this, If You Lived Here, with the Art Foundation, which was a kind of anti-gentrification show in New York, one of the kind of, let's say, cornerstones of the contemporary research-based, activist-related art practices. She did it as a project, because projects were basically established as a managerial tool on the one hand, but then in art, on the other hand, possibly it was a parallel development kind of thing, parallel evolution, as ways of linking what was previously unlinked, of connecting what was disconnected. So in regular managerial practice, it was basically about lean production. It was about freeing workers from bureaucratized hierarchies. It was about establishing small teams, project teams, that could be much more flexible and that could link outside of, let's say, bureaucratic control, people coming from the different departments or also from different industries, right? And in contemporary art, this connecting and linking was done so that artists could work with people of different specialization, something that now we take for granted. Like you have this EAT there, right? Like this experiments in art and technology, right? As part of the art utile. All the art utile stuff is done like projects, right? These are basically projects that people do. You do not have to do projects if you are a studio artist, because it's me, myself, and my art type of thing, at least in the kind of ideological version of this, highly romanticized. Because of course, with me, myself, and my studio is always part of the circulation, but is very much project-based in a sense that, you know, all the events that constitute your trajectory and your career are very much part of this hyper networks, right? So that in which your visibility is generated by projects in which you partake. So you may produce your stuff, whatever, you know, but then still this stuff needs to be put out there, and it's put out there as a project. Even bigger sales, right, are organized as projects. Markets, you know, like fairs, projects, right? And there are projects of different sort, and yet they are organized as kind of these pockets of accumulation. Yeah, biennales, everything, right? These are projects that you do, even if you produce for the studio. But in terms of medium, let's say, of like kind of organizational practice, for artists who operate in an expanded field of art, project is the bread and butter of your daily work.
Yeah, exactly, and also that there was a generation of artists that emerged that in a way didn't make work as such. They just made projects. Yeah, and it permitted, but then it also gave permission. Yeah. At the same time.
Yeah, I mean, like even if you think about different statistics, recently I read like, you know, this is anyway, typically it's a gloom and doom, but we will go soon to student party, don't worry, you know, like we will have a bit of a glue wine in a second. But then you know, the statistics are pretty depressive, because if you read, but artists in UK earn less than £15,000 yearly, but this is a typical income of a visual artist in UK. Where minimum wage possibly is, like, you know, much higher than that, and kind of affordable living is definitely much higher. Still, what is interesting is that community artists earn better, a bit better at least, but it's because they are able to be part of this economy in which they sell service and they do projects. It's not necessarily because the art market is based on the premise that you produce something and then you will sell it. But this really fails to materialize in 90% or 95% of cases. when in Poland the surveys were being made about with visual artists, and people were asked, so what is whether you sell art and how much you get for it. The typical answer was that the most common price, let's say, that people were receiving for the art was 200 euros or 250 euros, right? Because they were selling to the colleagues or family or something like this. It's more part of the family gift economy than anything else, right? So it's not necessarily, you do not think about blue chip stuff in which you just pay 100 millions for a painting on the auction, right? You think about the daily economies of people when they sell the painting to the mama or papa or cousin or whoever else, so that they can be exhibited in the family room, right?
Yeah, I remember us drawing that when we did one of the economics workshops. We did that drawing of is it the pyramid of visibility?
Yeah.
That we did?
Yeah.
Which is basically this...
It's a spotlight now.
Yeah.
Exactly, but this is how these economies operate in this sense that you think about. They are based on the kind of skewed economic perception, like social perception. So people who are most visible are in fact not a kind of average, Joe or Jane. It's basically people who are blue chip artists. They are the ones who occupy the place of hypervisibility in the spotlight. But the economies on which they are reliant upon are very exceptional. It's not like that people sell stuff for hundreds of millions. They are not Pierre Hugues. They are not Damien Hirst. They are not the ones who are shown at Prada or Pinot. The vast majority of people, like with artistic dark matter, they do a project here, a project there. They have this mixed economy, maybe an occasional sale, if they're lucky, a job at the university, and so on and so forth. And I think that on the other hand, like people say that this is not such a bad life, so we should also not exaggerate the misery of people who are part of it.
Yeah, we don't want total gloom and doom.
No.
Before the jolly party. But
I'm not the right person to actually.
But also in pulling this work together, in pulling this lexicon together, are there glimmers of a way out or another way of operating that you see? I mean, you touched upon, for example, the anti-fascist. Which in a way for me was quite positive because it's a way of kind of piggybacking the system or utilizing this system to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think of course, it's. I think it's on the one hand you can think of anti-fascist year. Let's say it was more about embedding projects, like individual projects, in some kind of like wider struggles. But this is something like this. Then delayed gratification is really delayed. Because you can think about, okay, so now I make a project about social justice, and you can make them for ages and ages. It's not necessarily, social justice we may fail to materialize, right? But then there are also ways how people are organizing their daily activities that may be much more equitable, much more based on mutual respect, on different forms of mutualization, of propping each other up, of also kind of like pragmatic calculations in a sense of thinking like pragmatism in a very commonsensical way. Thinking, okay, how you bargain for better wages, how do you share visibility with others? And I think there are a lot of platforms like this, and a lot of people who operate in this way, and that's why this social world is still ticking.
Yeah. I wonder if I can open up to the questions if anybody has any. Or requests for terms or comments, or if we can keep talking.
Yeah, maybe how would we? Okay, this is so official. I don't know if the question holds up to it. How would you historically, or when did what was once called Bohemia turn into what you call Projektariat, and what is the qualitative difference?
I mean, possibly Boltański and Czapello would say that this was in the West, let's say, after 60s, 68, 70s, 80s, that's when a certain type of bohemian critique of capitalism. Bohemians, they call it artistic critique of capitalism, which was motivated by such values as authenticity, freedom, creative freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of like flexibility, like flexibility in a sense that you are not bound to one job, 9 to 5, for the rest of your life, but rather you have freedom to pursue different forms of creative careers, and that this is flexibility in a sense that you are much more free to pursue this kind of interest. But you know, if you are, but there is an idea of mobility, there is an idea of certain type of nomadism and so on. That's what was that's what they termed, or like that's what they identified as this kind of artistic critique of capitalism before 68 even, right? So that's a kind of, let's say, the life, creative life driven by imagination and freedom rather than dullness and repetition, right? That was, and they say that 68 and all the student revolutions and situationist movements, that they were very much motivated by this kind of critique. So it was more about the freedom of expression and freedom to live creative life, rather than what they would call, just what was like, I think, equalitarian critique, in fact, of capitalism, that rather emphasized equality and distribution than expression, freedom of expression, and freedom to live creative life. So this was, let's say, 60s.
So in a sense, it was about not belonging to the status quo or the existing system. And what you describe now, if I don't listen to you for too long, I think it's very much about belonging to an image of a glamorous, to a glamorous life. So there's this perversity of, sorry.
Yeah, so like, you know, but because I drifted. But the point was that the entire argument of Boltanski and Capello is like this. Okay, so there was this criticism of capitalism. It came from different vantage points. Some of this criticism or critiques were informed by equality and redistribution of goods and comfort. This was more like trade unions, workers' movements, and so on. So that you simply earn more money for the job you are doing. And another part was motivated more by these bohemian values. So the capacity to live the life that is creative, that is not bound, that this is not structured by bureaucracy. But you know, it's based on criticism, kind of artistic criticism of capitalist alienation, of the life that is dull and that is organized either by bureaucracy or assembly line. And they say, okay, so this was 60s when this artistic criticism was spelled in social movements. And then capitalism, instead of crumbling, evolved and co-opted and implemented these forms of critique as parts of this new managerialism, which was basically the evolution of which dates back to 70s and 80s. So like capitalism, instead of saying, okay, so we need to keep on organizing entire production as big bureaucracies and as assembly lines, we will also be able to rather organize small creative teams of people who are much more free to pursue tasks that are not necessarily very directed from bottom up, but rather more self-directed. And that's how, and then, you know, this type of project-based work become popularized in creative industries, in these economies of enrichment. And we need to think about it also as part of the globalization. So let's say heavy industries or assembly lines were being shifted to third world countries. You know, like that became industrialized, like China, but also in Poland and so on and so forth in 90s. You know, so Poland is still an industrial economy. And while in countries, especially like Great Britain, you know, like you have
Thatcherism, it was about
Yeah, it was eradicating industrial base and shifting, let's say, and with it specific forms of social organization, such as assembly line, right? And then the emphasis was placed on service industries and on creative industries, which have a different form of organization. You just work differently there. And that's how I'm not sure whether I respond to your question.
I'm not so sure what the question was, but there's also this shift in image, in the public image of an artist from, which is like, I don't know if it's coterminous with this historical movement, dynamics, from the artist as a dropout that leads an authentic life to the artist as the model entrepreneur for the new capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that with this model entrepreneur, I wouldn't over-exaggerate it. When people are asking in Poland there was like a survey being made, like parents, what kind of job would they dream about for the kids? Only 1% responded that this would be being an artist.
I don't necessarily mean it in terms of, popularity,
it's still a terrible,
but in terms in a corporate perspective, where the artist suddenly turned into what corporations wanted their employees to turn into.
I mean, I think this was an argument being made in early 2000s already here, right? I mean, but the artist is a role model for this new type of...
it emerged like mid-90s or something.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That was the example for like the introduction of a more neoliberal model, and the artist turned to be a role model for like every freelancer, because there are so many more freelancers in society than just artists. Artists are just more seen in this, So that's why I was mentioning the invention of the Ich AG that happened in 2003, in that time when that was not Hartz IV, it was still Hartz II, but you could go to the Arbeitsamt and found an Ich AG, so you could found a firm being basically yourself, like the name. And I thought that was really a very telling picture, but it is not just the picture, because the Ich AG was very temporal, and because before there existed a security system also for people who were like doing projects, because it would pay you, the Arbeitslosengeld would pay you in between projects, and the Ich AG was just a little turnover gift to no system anymore. That is the interesting thing, and that like security system in German society then disappeared around 20 years ago.
Yeah, but I think it also it mirrored, and it's kind of like your question, which was what's the difference between Bohemia and this, is in a way it's a switch from ways of producing value that changed. So it used to be much more direct. So you would produce a product that then had a certain value, and it was either had value or not. And that might be in making cars, or it might be making objects and manufacturing and industry. And it shifted in the 80s from the rise of neoliberalism to really about making stories. And the production industry, basically wealth being generated by storytelling. If you think about Apple, it's not really a product range. It's a storyline that happens to have products that are generated from the story. And there's many other, Audi, actually in the 80s was interesting. Their Vorsprung der Technik campaign was exactly that. It was an idea that then was used to sell cars. And I think in a way, like the means of production in the art world followed that strategy, where you kind of you either made it as an artist or you didn't. You were kind of successful, you were Picasso, you sold artworks and you made money, or you could afford, you were like an upper class bohemian and you hung out, it didn't matter whether you sold things or not. There was a differentiation that happened, you're either in or out, and there was a singular art world. And now there are multiple art worlds, and there are multiple ways of generating, and so everybody's kind of also then generating storylines, which I think a lot of your keywords touch upon. This idea of creating your, and it's the same with the kind of century of the self model as well. It's about making your own story, my narrative arc, my personal, all that is what creates the value rather than necessarily what you do. And I think that's also mirrored with the kind of forms of contemporary and post-contemporary art that have enabled that too.
Yeah, but also, I think, what you Alistair said is definitely correct. In terms of coming back to this boheme, right? I mean, we think about, let's say, very mythologized, kind of we have very mythologized, romanticized notions of boheme. But still, when we think about it, it was a kind of exception in the capitalist order. So it was boheme was against, let's say, money-grabbing bourgeois. It was, it was people who were, birds of the air, but who do not sow, they do not reap. They just simply live out of thin air, in a sense, right? There was always romantic myths of people who commit themselves to life that is more free and more creative. That was valuable because of the backdrop in which most of people lived lives that are dull and not authentic.
What's the romantic myth of the Projektariat?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's a very romantic notion.
What makes you enter these work conditions?
Oh no, because this is, but let's think about this. What happens now is that art industry is a huge industry, right? You have hundreds and hundreds of. It grew exponentially. Even contemporary art as a kind of and then people start to think about it not necessarily as a boheme, as a kind of suicidal, more or less suicidal.
It's actually not a job.
Yeah,
Art's not a job.
I mean, it used not to be a job,
Yeah.
right? And now people think about it as a profession, right? As something, it's a career path that you can pursue. And yet, you can pursue it. Maybe you will not expect, not a lot of people, I think, expect to earn God knows how much. And yet, and lots of people who go into art, they are able to afford it somehow. In a sense, they do not come from impoverished proletariat, right? It's quite a lot of middle-class people, I think, around this. Or upper class as well. From time to time, but then, it's a life that gives you a creative freedom. You don't have to go to work. You are self. You go to Venice. You go to Venice.
That's still the Bohemian myth, a life of freedom.
No, because Bohemia was unless you were, and of course that's an argument too. But in fact, in contrast to the very romanticized myths about Boheme, in a sense that these were people who were mixing with lumpen proletariat, drinking absinthe, and good punk rockers dying before the age of 30. But some of them actually lived long enough to see. To see themselves, aging, but still, it was quite an exception, right? If in a kind of general sense, and capitalism evolved, this kind of values that before were being considered marginal, because it was more the values we think about 19th century bourgeois societies, it was more about orderly conduct. Being respectable, having a proper job, having a job and a family, and the German literature is filled with this kind of ethos, right, of what it means to be a productive member of productive society, right? 19th century, early 20th century. You think about Thomas Mann, whatever, and then this was a kind of this was the values upon which societies were based, and now capitalism and societies evolved, at least in the West, right? You have individualism, authenticity, creativity, the capacity to live this kind of unconstrained life.
And cultural degeneration.
Yeah, cultural. Yeah, and then being a kind of bourgeois boheme, you know, it's basically at the core of consumerist society. It's not, you know, artists are not an exception in this, in a sense.
Maybe you also to make the difference between Bohemia and Projektariat is there where Bohemia is much more connected to a society which is based on discipline, and the Projektariat is much more connected to a society where self-control, or you also were describing control as an own chapter, for example, where this became more important, and actually these guidelines of a disciplined society doesn't exist anymore.
I mean, they do. I mean, like, the level of incarceration is huge, you know. So it's not necessarily, but
in the working world, of course, of this liberal or neoliberal society. I mean, it functions differently than in a society where the assembly line was the major, here in the West, was the major frame. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, so this is, but do I?
No, I agree with all this. Like, maybe
Yes,
is what makes us want to enter these working relationships.
Yeah, I think.
I don't
yeah.
think it's just what makes us enter these working relationships, and I don't think it's just the promise of being paid later, or becoming famous later, or
no,
something.
it's not about the promise of being paid later. You know, it's more. I think that this it's more, but you are being paid for being yourself. So that's, you know, so that you can still realize all these interesting projects. I mean, like, I believe that my projects are interesting. That's what I want to do, right? This is something that interests me, to which I respond with enthusiasm. You know, like all of the projects, or like most of the projects that I've done, even if they were related to some sort of like frustration and burnout, still this is something that was initiated, not as an opportunity just to be. Just to earn money, but also there is always this element of being invested in it because you like what you do, right? And then what you like to do is basically, at least in my case, was realizing something that, well, it's tautological, but that's how works our investments. You know, I'm interested because I find it interesting, right? Very often, right? But this is, let's say, more in terms of social organization. Right, you just you have a very high degree of control over what you are doing, at least in terms of content, how you organize your life as well. Right, as a freelancer, you are not like 9 to 5. You do not go to 9 to 5 job. If you work for the institution, if you work, which is a kind of a bit of a compromise always, you know. But if you are part of the I mean, basically, a workplace discipline. You know, you need to be on time. You need to do what is more or less expected of you, and so on and so forth. You know, still these jobs can be organized differently depending on the sector. In the contemporary art, usually, you have much higher freedom to decide what is a project that you are going to work on, right? In comparison to, let's say, selling cars, so there is a high degree of autonomy, let's say, that usually people cherish, as in a sense autonomy of also deciding what you are going to do, and if you are a freelancer, also how you are going to do it, in shaping this your life pattern. And I think that this is what is attractive. I think that also the life of this kind of freedom is an attractor, I think, for at least it used to be for me.
I just wanted to comment or to add that I think I learned, I think there is an essay über the figure of the Projektemacher. It's also like 15 or 20 years old. That was back in the time of the 2000s, and that was a description of a belief system, actually. Like an utopian belief system that of the importance of the individual or the individual artist who can change the world with single projects. actually. And the essay was saying that this concept comes actually from 19th century and is a kind of romantic project. So I think there is a connection, and maybe there's a connection in this from what you were asking, Daniel. So I would say yes, it is a romantic project.
No, there is this element. Of course, there is still, and so it's not like this that these bohemian values were eradicated, or that they were totally revamped or utterly co-opted and corrupted. There's still, there's still a kind of, I think, if you think about the kind of libidinal economy of this world, definitely this romantic ethos is part of it. But then, the expectation, I think, in terms of what's different in terms of Projektariat, is that you are still expected, or you expect that sooner or later you will be able to make it into a professional life. But this is not something that is just, that you do not earn money now and you won't earn for the rest of your life, right? But this is more something, a transitionary, like this kind of being unpaid is more like a transitory moment. So that you rather kind of invest yourself into it because under the premise that you will be able to make your living out of living this kind of romantic life. Of more free, less bound, less structured, more autonomous, more creative. I think. I mean, at least this is. I'm not sure. Like possibly people would need to respond for themselves, but this was quite clear when we are making surveys in Poland. But that's what people expected, right? How long are we?
Are there more comments?
Do you think that COVID changed something in the attitude of artists? That they say, okay, we need a break, we need long-term relationships, we need long-term payment, or are we back?
I think that at least that's more like anecdotal. But I think that for a lot of people, it was a moment in which they said, "I'm just, I give up. I just don't want to do this shit anymore." Like that. This is something that. But this was such a major shift for quite a lot of people who did not have any stable jobs, who did not have a kind of secured savings or money or something like this, in which and maybe even
catering industry.
Yeah.
This way, yeah.
So catering is, yeah. I mean, it was not only in arts. I think lots of people in different kind of industries. Like so, for example, I had later on in a lot of also art, performance related professions or technicians. It's not necessarily even artists, technicians, but also people who are working in gastronomy. Right? They just decided to requalify, say, okay, I do not want to be part of this any longer. It's closed for such a long time, but I cannot pursue this career path. And I think this was similar. At least, I've heard stories about opera singers who said, okay, I'm done. I'm becoming an accountant. This is. I mean, if you are a part of the, contemporary dance scene or something like that, in which, at least in visual arts, we can discuss about how dependent this is on particular let's say, on the biological age and on the social age. But in some sectors, it's even more important. So if you are an opera singer, you may have, in sports, right? You may have just to, you're kind of, let's say, window of opportunity basically closes in one moment because of your physical capacities, It's not about social construction. It's because you simply are not able to be as flexible or to pursue this very physically straining dance performances, for example, right? So then basically the clock is ticking in a sense. And in terms of visual artists, let's say it's more social construction, in this sense that you have that a lot of this industry is geared upon finding the new bright things. you know, and new bright people, new bright faces, right? Like, and then the rediscovering mostly women artists when they are already elderly or are not with us any longer, you know. That's what is the kind of saying about art market, right? But if you are a woman artist, you will make money when you are dead, you know. But then at least it used to be a couple of years ago. Now it's possibly changing, but still, you know, there is this kind of like, there is this pursuit of novelty. So if you do not make it by the age of 35 or 40, possibly this is a signal that you won't make it at all, right? And a lot of things are being geared towards that. Also in terms of you know, how the stipends are being structured and so on and so forth, but this is just a peak of the iceberg. I think it's more important is how the whole industry operates. What are the expectations and so on and so forth, you know? So what is the moment in which from becoming a promising artist, you become a failed artist, right? Who failed to deliver on this promise. This is very intangible, and it's also part of the allure, I guess, because you can always think that maybe it will happen, right? So then that's what also keeps people going. But what really typically is a threshold when people say, okay, I have enough of this stuff, it may be COVID, but it's usually a family, right? I mean, when you really need to deliver, when you really need to put a bread on your table, a lot of people are saying, okay, you know, is there something is going to change, or I'm not going to do it any longer, you know? And then they really look for the different type of jobs, and at least, you know, this is how the illusion of this very youthful, enthusiastic, and childless world is being maintained, because a lot of people who are not young, who have kids, are simply not as present as part of it any longer. But who you see are only people who are actually who made it in this sense. There's very exceptional people with very exceptional economies who managed to stay in circulation. But in terms of statistics, possibly there are just few of the generation, you know. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's maybe time to go to the party.
Yeah, because this was, you know, doom and gloom. This is where we ended up.
On that note.
This, like,
no, but it's a very important discussion, and actually thinking it reflects also on the discussions we had with the symposium last week in the postgraduate phase about, in a way, the hierarchy, even in the German system, the kind of class system and the hierarchy of who is permitted to have what kind of jobs, what kind of research, what kind, you know, where they sit, and I think that's also symptomatic. But we could discuss, I think, for a long, you know, there's another 50 terms in the book as well that we could talk about. But I think maybe we've exhausted you, or sucked enough out of you for now. But we'll close it here. I think I should add for the recording as well that if the book, ABC of the Projektariat, is available in all good bookshops, including ZKM. If you want to buy one now, you can do it at a discount price. And I just want to say a big thank you, Kuba, for coming here on your plane, and then back again on your plane as part of
partially it's train journey.
And thank you to our technical team as well for filming and the sound, and for Lily and our colleagues at the Half K for organising this. So thank you all, and we can go and join the future Projektariat in the Half K.
And then we can enjoy